The 73-year-old retired FBI chief sat at the luxury Chicago restaurant, watching as his daughter's polished fiancé brazenly demanded a $750,000 investment for a destination wedding and a suspect business deal, clearly expecting a wealthy, aging father to simply sign the check. Just as the man flashed a rehearsed, winning smile, Rick felt his daughter slip a frantic, sweat-stained napkin into his hand under the table. "Dad, he's a monster. Help me." Without breaking eye contact, the veteran investigator offered a terrifyingly calm smile and uttered just 2 words that instantly shattered the predator's smug mask and turned his confidence to dust. "Prove it." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to drown out the low hum of the 95th floor dining room and the distant clink of silver against china. Julian Sterling, a man who had spent the last 10 months meticulously tailoring his persona to fit the image of a high-flying venture capitalist, looked as though he had been struck. The practiced, golden boy radiance in his eyes flickered, replaced by a momentary, jagged panic that only someone with Rick Vance's 40 years of experience would have caught. Rick did not blink. He felt the dampness of the napkin in his palm, the desperate plea from his only child burning into his skin like a brand. His mind, trained in the brutal art of the interrogation room, was already moving 10 steps ahead. He watched Julian's throat move in a hard, dry swallow. Julian cleared his throat, trying to regain his footing with a shaky laugh. He said that he thought they were past the stage of formal audits and that he believed they were becoming a family. He reached out to cover Emily's hand, but Rick noticed the way his daughter's fingers flinched, pulling back just an inch toward the edge of the white linen tablecloth. Rick leaned forward, his large, weathered hands resting flat on the table. He said that $750,000 was a very specific number for a man who claimed to be an expert in market fluctuations. He told Julian that if he wanted nearly $1 million of the Vance family legacy, he would need to see the itemized breakdown of the Lake Como venue fees, the specific tail numbers for the chartered flights, and most importantly, the registered corporate filing for the Sterling Global Fund. Victoria, who had been playing the role of the supportive, sophisticated sister with practiced ease, tried to intervene. She leaned in, her voice dripping with a syrupy, southern charm that felt entirely out of place in the cold Chicago winter. She said that Rick was being a bit intense and that they were all there to celebrate a union of hearts, not a corporate merger. She suggested that perhaps the champagne had gone to his head. Rick turned his gaze toward her. It was the same look he had used to break white-collar criminals in federal holding cells. He did not raise his voice. He told her that in his world, a union of hearts was built on transparency, not secret demands made over a Sunday lunch. He looked back at Julian and asked him why a venture capitalist with his supposed portfolio was so desperate for a retired man's savings. Julian's face began to flush a dark, angry red. The charm was evaporating, revealing a petulant, aggressive core. He said that he was offering Emily a life of prestige and that Rick was being insulting by questioning his integrity. He claimed that the Italian vendors required a non-refundable deposit by the end of the business day and that any delay would jeopardize the entire event. Rick felt Emily's leg trembling against his under the table. He knew his daughter. She was a brilliant surgeon, a woman who dealt with life and death every day, yet here she was, reduced to a terrified passenger in her own life. The realization that this man had spent months eroding her confidence made Rick's blood turn to ice. He asked Julian to name one lead partner at the firm he claimed to represent. Julian hesitated for 3 seconds, a lifetime in an interrogation. He eventually spat out a name that Rick knew was a mid-level analyst at a firm that had folded 5 years ago. Rick took a slow sip of his water, his eyes never leaving Julian's. He said that he had spent his career listening to men tell him stories they thought were perfect. He told Julian that every lie has a tell, and Julian's was his arrogance. He pointed out that Julian had assumed a 73-year-old man was an easy mark, a soft target blinded by his love for his daughter. Victoria tried one last time to pivot the conversation, mentioning that they had a car waiting and that perhaps they should all take a breath and discuss this later when everyone was less emotional. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress, her eyes darting toward the exit. Rick did not stand. He sat there like a mountain, immovable and dangerous. He told her to sit down. He said that the lunch was not over until he was satisfied, and right now, he was far from it. He watched as the two scammers exchanged a quick, frantic look, the realization finally dawning on them that they had not walked into a trap, they had walked into an execution. Julian tried to stand, his voice rising in a sharp, defensive tone. He told Emily that they didn't have to stay and be interrogated by a man who was clearly losing his grip on reality. He reached for her arm, his grip looking tighter than it should have been. Rick's voice dropped an octave, becoming a low, vibrating growl. He told Julian that if he touched his daughter again, the police waiting downstairs would be the least of his problems. The threat was quiet, professional, and absolutely sincere. Julian froze. The restaurant seemed to go silent as the surrounding tables finally noticed the lethal tension at the corner booth. Rick knew he had them. The mask was not just shattered, it was pulverized. Now, he just had to get his daughter out of the kill zone. Would you like me to proceed to part 2, the silent extraction, where Rick maneuvers Emily away from the restaurant and deals with the initial shock of her confession? Rick stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and heavy with a quiet, lethal authority that seemed to drain the remaining oxygen from the room. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, tossing $300 in crisp bills onto the table to cover a meal that had turned into a crime scene. He looked at Julian and Victoria, whose faces were caught in a grotesque transition between forced politeness and jagged, unrefined malice. Rick told them that he was taking his daughter home to review the private terms of the family trust. He stated that the $750,000 was a complex disbursement and that he would not discuss the logistics of such a sum in a public dining room with people he barely knew. Julian started to protest, his voice cracking with a desperate sort of entitlement. He tried to argue that they were a family now and that secrets were the poison of a good marriage. But Rick silenced him with a single, icy stare that reminded everyone at the table exactly who had spent 40 years staring down the most dangerous men in the country. Rick told Julian that the conversation was over. He turned to Emily, whose face was a ghostly shade of white, and placed a firm, protective hand on her shoulder. He told her it was time to leave. The walk to the elevator felt like an eternity. The 95th floor was a blur of gold leaf and mahogany, but the atmosphere inside the wood-paneled car was suffocating. Emily leaned against the corner, her breathing shallow and ragged, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she were trying to disappear into the carpet. Rick watched the numbers descend in silence. He could feel the heat radiating from the sweat-stained napkin still crumpled in his fist. Every second they moved further away from the restaurant, the weight of his daughter's terror seemed to grow, pressing against his chest until it was hard to breathe. When they hit the lobby and the doors slid open, the cold Chicago wind slapped them in the face, a brutal and honest contrast to the artificial warmth of the signature room. Rick led her to his black SUV, the tires crunching on the frozen slush of the street. He opened the door for her, watching as she climbed into the passenger seat and curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the low rumble of the motor the only sound in the cabin for several long minutes. As Rick pulled out into the heavy traffic of Michigan Avenue, the city lights blurred into long, neon streaks across the windshield. He glanced at Emily. The surgeon, The woman who had spent 15 years mastering the art of precision and nerves of steel was shivering so hard that her teeth were literally chattering. She wasn't just cold. She was in shock. Rick reached over and turned the heater to its maximum setting, but he knew that no amount of warmth could reach the place where she was currently hiding. He chose not to speak. He knew from 1,000 hours in interrogation rooms that silence was often the most powerful tool, but this time, he wasn't using it to break a suspect. He was using it to give his daughter a moment to breathe without the pressure of a witness. He drove with a grim, focused intensity, his mind cataloging the facts of the last hour. He thought about Julian's aggressive posture, the way Victoria had tried to gaslight him with a smile, and the sheer audacity of a $750,000 demand. Inside, Rick was a tempest of fury and guilt. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his gut as he realized how much he had missed while he was preoccupied with his own retirement and his antique books. He had let a predator into his daughter's life. He had allowed a wolf to sit at their Sunday lunch. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, the knuckles white and the skin aged but still strong, and he promised his late wife that he would burn the world down before he let that man touch their daughter again. They reached his brownstone in the Gold Coast 20 minutes later. The neighborhood was quiet, the trees skeletal against the gray sky. Rick parked the car and walked around to Emily's side. He helped her out, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist to keep her upright as they walked up the stone steps. Once inside, the familiar smell of old paper, cedar wood, and gun oil usually brought Rick a sense of peace, but tonight the house felt like a fortress under siege. He guided Emily to the large leather armchair in his study, the room where he spent most of his days surrounded by the remnants of his career. He didn't ask her for the details yet. Instead, he went to the kitchen and made a pot of strong, black tea, adding a spoonful of honey just the way she liked it when she was a little girl. He brought it back and placed it in her trembling hands. The light from the desk lamp cast long, flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the rows of federal law books and the framed commendations from the Department of Justice. Rick sat in the chair opposite her, leaning back and watching her with the eyes of a father who was slowly, methodically turning back into a hunter. He saw the way she clutched the mug as if it were a life raft. Finally, the first sob broke through. It was a small, choked sound that quickly escalated into a deep, guttural wail of pure agony. Emily dropped her head into her hands, the mug clicking against the table as she let go. Rick didn't move to comfort her with empty words. He sat there, a solid and immovable pillar of granite, letting her grief wash over the room. He watched her shoulders shake, his heart breaking in a way it hadn't since the day he buried her mother. Behind his calm exterior, Rick was already building the framework of the investigation. He was mentally drafting the list of contacts he would need to call. He was visualizing the bank records he would need to subpoena. But for now, he simply watched the woman he loved most in the world unravel. He knew that before he could seek justice, he had to let her find the truth. And the truth, he could already tell, was going to be far darker than a simple wedding scam. Emily finally looked up, her mascara running in dark tracks down her cheeks, her voice a mere whisper that barely carried across the desk. She said that she was so sorry and that she didn't know how it had gotten this far. She said that Julian had made her feel like she was the one who was crazy, like she was the one who was failing him. She looked at her father with an expression of such profound shame that Rick had to close his eyes for a moment to keep his own composure. He told her that it wasn't her fault. He told her that men like Julian made a living out of making good people feel small. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady, and told her that they were going to fix this. Not just the money, but everything. He told her that the predator had picked the wrong family, and now he was going to learn why. The golden light from the desk lamp carved deep shadows into the mahogany walls of the study as Rick Vance pulled a fresh yellow legal pad from his drawer. He clicked his heavy silver pen, a habit from 1,000 midnight sessions at the bureau, and looked at his daughter. He told her to start from the very beginning. He said he needed every date, every name, and every excuse Julian had ever used. He didn't want the virgin she told her friends. He wanted the evidence. Emily took a shaky breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her cooling tea. She began to describe their first meeting at a high-end charity gala for pediatric oncology 10 months ago. She said Julian had appeared like a character from a movie, impeccably dressed and seemingly fascinated by her work. He hadn't talked about himself at all. Instead, he had spent 4 hours asking her about the complexities of neonatal surgery. Rick's pen scratched across the paper. He noted the classic opening of a professional predator, the mirrors and smoke of false empathy. Julian hadn't been interested in her work. He had been profiling her. As the night wore on, the anatomy of the scam became agonizingly clear. Emily described the first 3 months as a whirlwind of love bombing. Julian had sent flowers to the hospital every single day. He had flown her to New York for dinner on a whim. He had made her feel like the center of a very expensive, very beautiful universe. But then, the subtle shifts began. Rick listened as his daughter detailed the gradual isolation. Julian had started making small, offhand comments about her colleagues. He told her that her chief of surgery was taking credit for her brilliance. He suggested that her best friend, Sarah, was only hanging around because she was jealous of Emily's success. Rick felt a cold, familiar anger tighten in his chest as Emily admitted that she had eventually stopped seeing her friends altogether. Julian had convinced her that they were a distraction from the deep, soulmate connection they shared. It was the textbook playbook of a cult leader or a high-level con artist. Cut off the support system until the victim has no one to talk to but the person hurting them. Then came the financial bleeding. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper as she recounted the first time Julian asked for money. It hadn't been a demand. It had been an emergency, a temporary cash flow issue with his international fund due to a clerical error in London. He had looked so embarrassed, so devastated to even ask, that she had practically forced the $5,000 on him. Rick wrote the number down in words, $5,000. That had been the crack in the dam. 2 weeks later, there was an urgent need for $15,000 to secure a land deed in Switzerland. A month after that, $20,000 for a legal settlement involving a disgruntled former employee who was supposedly trying to blackmail Julian's family. Each time, Julian had promised to pay her back with interest the moment his dividends cleared. Each time, he had used her love and her sense of loyalty as a weapon against her. Rick looked down at his legal pad. The numbers were staggering when added together. 5,000, 15,000, 20,000. A bridge loan for a boutique investment. A medical bill for Victoria's supposed heart condition. By the time Emily reached the end of the list, the total was $85,000. Rick wrote it out in bold, block letters. $85,000 of his daughter's hard-earned money vanished into the pockets of a man who didn't exist. He asked her about the wedding demand. Emily wiped her eyes and said that the $750,000 request had started as a suggestion about their future. Julian had told her that he wanted to buy a villa in Lake Como that could serve as both a wedding venue and a family legacy. He had told her that his own capital was tied up in a 5-year lock-in period and that if her father truly cared about her security, he would see this as an investment, not an expense. When she had hesitated, Julian had turned cold. He had told her she was being selfish. He had told her she was acting like a spoiled child instead of a partner. Rick stopped writing and looked at his daughter. He saw the hollowed-out look in her eyes, the exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting a war she didn't even know she was in. He told her that Julian hadn't been looking for a wife. He had been looking for an ATM with a pulse. He explained that the $75,000 Julian had already taken was just the proof of concept. The $750,000 wedding was the exit strategy. Rick stood up and walked over to a heavy iron safe hidden behind a row of law books. He opened it and pulled out a burner phone he hadn't used in 3 years. He turned it on, the small screen glowing blue in the dim light. He told Emily that Julian Sterling had made one fatal mistake. He had assumed that Rick was just a lonely old man with a large bank account. He hadn't realized that Rick spent 25 of his 40 years in the bureau specializing in international fraud and asset forfeiture. He told Emily to go upstairs and get some sleep. He promised her that by the time the sun came up, Julian and Victoria would be the ones living in a nightmare. He watched her walk out of the room, her shoulders still slumped with shame, and the moment the door clicked shut, the father disappeared. The hunter took his place. Rick sat back down at his desk and dialed a number that wasn't in any public directory. He waited for the third ring. When a gravelly voice answered on the other end, Rick didn't say hello. He said that he had a ghost in Chicago who needed to be summoned. He said he had a name, a face, and 85,000 reasons to tear a man's life apart. He told his contact to wake up the network. The anatomy lesson was over. The surgery was about to begin. The clock on the wall of Rick Vance's study struck 2 in the morning, but the retired FBI chief felt more awake than he had in nearly a decade. The city of Chicago outside his window was a frozen landscape of steel and shadows, the wind howling off the lake like a wounded animal. Rick knew that to catch a predator who lived in the digital ether, he needed people who knew how to navigate the machine. He picked up his secure phone and sent a single encrypted message to a number that had been dormant for 3 years. The message was simple and carried the weight of a royal decree: the judge needs a favor. By 4 in the morning, Rick was pulling his SUV into the gravel parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the far south side. This was a place where the coffee was strong enough to strip paint and the waitresses were paid to look the other way when men in expensive coats sat with people who looked like they lived in a basement. Rick stepped into the warmth of the diner, the smell of burnt grease and old cigarettes clinging to the air. He scanned the back booths and found exactly who he was looking for. Marcus was 32 years old and possessed a mind that saw the world in lines of code and binary logic. He had been Rick's most trusted digital forensic analyst during the final decade of his career, a man who could ghost through a bank's firewall as easily as most people walked through a revolving door. Beside him sat Sarah, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and eyes that looked like they were made of flint. She was a former federal prosecutor who now ran a high-end boutique defense firm, but her heart had always remained with the investigators. She was the sharpest legal mind Rick had ever encountered, a woman who could find a needle in a haystack and then use that needle to pin a criminal to the wall. Rick slid into the booth without a word. He didn't offer a greeting, and they didn't expect one. He placed his heavy leather portfolio on the scratched Formica table and pushed it toward the center. He told them that his daughter was being hunted. He said that a man calling himself Julian Sterling had already bled her for $85,000 and was currently moving in for a $750,000 kill under the guise of a wedding. Sarah reached for her coffee, her expression darkening as she listened to the details. She asked Rick about Victoria, the supposed sister. Rick described the woman from the restaurant, her syrupy charm and the way she had tried to gaslight him into believing his daughter's happiness was tied to a checkbook. Sarah nodded slowly. She told Rick that the name Victoria felt familiar. She mentioned a case out of New Jersey from 2 years ago involving a wealthy widower who had lost nearly $1 million to a brother and sister teen before they vanished into the night. She said the modus operandi was identical: the isolation of the victim, the manufactured financial emergencies, and the final, massive demand for a life-changing investment. Marcus had already opened a rugged, military-grade laptop. His fingers danced across the keys with a rhythmic clicking that filled the quiet diner. He told Rick that the Sterling Global Fund was a masterpiece of fiction. He had spent the last hour digging through international registries and found that the website was nothing more than a sophisticated shell. The corporate photos were stock images from a German marketing firm. The office address in London was a virtual mailbox that had been shut down for non-payment 6 months ago. He looked up at Rick, his face pale in the glow of the screen. He told Rick that Julian Sterling was a ghost. There was no record of him before 3 years ago. No social security activity, no tax filings, no credit history that wasn't tied to a burner identity. He said that the man was a professional chameleon. Marcus then pulled up a blurred image from a traffic camera in Dallas from 18 months ago. It showed a man who looked remarkably like Julian, though his hair was darker and he was wearing heavy framed glasses. Sitting in the passenger seat of the luxury car was Victoria. The vehicle had been registered to a woman who had filed for bankruptcy shortly after the pair left the state. Rick felt a cold, hard knot of satisfaction settle in his stomach. He wasn't dealing with a lucky amateur. He was dealing with a syndicate. He told Marcus and Sarah that Julian had picked the wrong city for his retirement fund. He said that Emily was safe for now, tucked away in the brownstone, but they had to move fast before Julian realized the game had changed. Sarah leaned in, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. She told Rick that if they could prove Julian and Victoria were using the same bank accounts for multiple scams, they could move beyond simple theft and into the territory of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. She mentioned that the $750,000 demand was the key. Because Julian had sent the preliminary budget through an encrypted email service across state lines, he had already committed federal wire fraud. Rick looked at his old friends, the fire of the hunt finally burning bright in his eyes. He told them that he didn't just want a conviction. He wanted a total collapse of their world. He asked Marcus to start tracking every digital footprint Julian had left in the last 3 years. He asked Sarah to prepare the legal framework for a sting that would be airtight. He said that he was going to give Julian exactly what he wanted, a meeting to discuss the money. But instead of a check, he was going to give him a front row seat to his own destruction. As the sun began to peek over the gray horizon of Chicago, casting long, pale light across the frozen streets, the three of them walked out of the diner. Rick felt the weight of the years falling off his shoulders. He told Sarah and Marcus that the predator thought he was playing with a retired old man. He said that Julian Sterling was about to find out that a judge never truly leaves the bench, and a father never truly stops being a protector. The network was awake, the shadows were moving, and the hunt had officially begun. The city of Chicago was still buried under a layer of pre-dawn blue when the high-resolution monitor in Rick Vance's study chimed with a priority notification. Marcus had delivered. Rick sat back, the leather of his chair creaking as he opened the encrypted file labeled The Ledger of Lies. The first image that flickered onto the screen was a mugshot from 7 years ago in Nevada. The man was younger, his hair cropped short and his jawline less refined, but the eyes were unmistakable. Julian Sterling was actually Arthur Jenkins, a man whose criminal record was a roadmap of deception across the western United States. Rick leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the biological data. The most jarring revelation wasn't Julian's real name, but the identity of the woman who sat beside him at Sunday lunch. Victoria Jenkins was not his sister. She was his former wife and current business partner. Rick felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the depth of the depravity. They had sat in a luxury restaurant and played the role of a loving, sophisticated family, using a biological lie to make Emily feel safe, all while they were an organized criminal duo who had shared a marriage and a decade of fraud. The file contained a detailed list of previous marks, and Rick spent the next hour reading through the wreckage of lives destroyed by the Jenkins pair. The first major victim was Margaret Holloway, a 60-year-old widow from Seattle. She had lost her husband's life insurance payout of $500,000 after Arthur Jenkins, then calling himself a maritime architect, convinced her to invest in a luxury yacht charter business that never existed. Margaret had died penniless in a state-run nursing home 3 months after Arthur disappeared. Next was Elena Rossi, a high-fashion entrepreneur in New York. The script had been nearly identical to the one they were currently running on Emily. Arthur had used a different name, but the bait was the same: a destination wedding in Tuscany and a joint investment in a European textile mill. Elena had transferred $350,000 before her internal accounting team flagged the suspicious routing numbers. By then, Arthur and Victoria had vanished, leaving Elena with a shattered heart and a business on the brink of bankruptcy. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. They always chose women who were successful but isolated, people who had a high net worth and a deep emotional void. They didn't just take the money. They dismantled the victim's sense of reality. Rick saw the names of 2 other women, one in Denver and another in Phoenix, who had lost a combined total of $400,000 in what they called the wedding deposit trap. The total documented losses across all victims reached nearly $1,500,000. Rick looked up at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He thought of his daughter sleeping upstairs, unaware that she was merely the 5th chapter in a book of blood and broken promises. The audacity of Arthur Jenkins to demand $750,000 from a man like Rick Vance was not just a crime, it was an insult to his 40 years of service. He saw that Arthur and Victoria had refined their scheme with every hit, becoming more brazen and more demanding as they moved from mark to mark. Just as Rick was closing the file, his daughter's phone, which was sitting on the corner of his desk, buzzed with a series of urgent text messages. He picked it up and read the words from Julian. The tone had shifted from charming to subtly aggressive. Julian claimed that he had heard from the Lake Como estate manager and that a rival bidder from a Russian energy firm was offering more for the wedding dates they wanted. He told Emily that they had exactly 4 hours to wire the initial deposit of $100,000 or the entire vision for their perfect day would be lost forever. He added that Victoria was already at the bank and that they were waiting for her confirmation. Rick didn't hesitate. He knew that the predator was getting restless, his greed starting to override his caution. He picked up his secure line and called Marcus back. He told his analyst to create a digital trail that would make Julian believe the money was moving. He wanted to feed the monster just enough to keep him at the table. He said they needed to lure the couple into a specific legal jurisdiction where the federal wire fraud charges would carry the maximum penalty. Marcus told him that he had already flagged the current accounts Julian was using. They were routed through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, but the primary access point was a private bank in downtown Chicago. Rick realized that they were closer to the end than he had thought. He asked Marcus to send the full dossier to Sarah, the prosecutor. He said he wanted the arrest warrants drafted and ready by noon. Rick walked to the window and watched the first rays of the sun hit the Willis Tower. He saw his reflection in the glass, a 73-year-old man who looked like he had stepped out of an old noir film. He was tired, but the fire of the hunt had settled into a cold, blue flame. He realized that this wasn't just about saving his daughter anymore. It was about Margaret Holloway, Elena Rossi, and the countless other women whose lives had been treated as collateral damage by the Jenkins team. He went back to his desk and began a handwritten note on his legal pad, listing the specific charges he would present to the district attorney. Wire fraud, identity theft, aggravated larceny, money laundering, racketeering. He wrote them out slowly, savoring the weight of each word. He knew that Arthur and Victoria thought they were the smartest people in the room, but they had forgotten the most basic rule of the con: never try to outplay a man who spent his life writing the rules of the game. Rick picked up Emily's phone and typed a short, calculated response to Julian. He said that Emily was still resting, but that her father had spent the night reviewing the Lake Como proposal and was impressed by the potential. He wrote that Rick wanted to meet at Julian's office at 2 in the afternoon to sign the $750,000 disbursement in person. He added that he expected the wedding planner and the legal representative for the fund to be present for the formal signing. As he pressed send, Rick felt the trap snap shut. He knew Julian's greed would never allow him to say no to nearly $1 million. The ledger of lies was about to be closed for good, and Rick Vance was going to be the one to write the final sentence. He sat back, took a final sip of his cold coffee, and waited for the monster to take the bait. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the brownstone, casting long, pale stripes across the kitchen island where Rick sat with 2 mugs of black coffee. When Emily finally walked into the room, she looked like a shadow of her former self, her eyes puffed from a night of restless sleep and her shoulders hunched as if she were expecting a blow. Rick did not offer her pity. He knew that pity would only keep her in the role of the victim. Instead, he pushed the second mug toward her and told her that today was the day she took her life back. He laid out the legal pad on the granite surface, the handwriting sharp and unforgiving. He told her that he had spent the night confirming that Julian and Victoria were professional predators who had destroyed lives from Seattle to New York. He watched as the realization hit her, the shame on her face momentarily replaced by a cold, sharp flicker of betrayal. Rick leaned in, his voice steady and low. He told her that he needed her to be the woman he raised, the doctor who could keep her hands steady in a room full of blood. He said that for the next 6 hours, she was not Julian's fiancé. She was an undercover operative in a federal sting. The training began in the quiet of the kitchen. Rick coached her on the tone she needed to strike. He told her that she had to apologize, but not too much. He said that Julian's ego required him to believe he had won the psychological battle at the restaurant. Rick instructed her to tell Julian that her father was simply an old, stubborn man who was terrified of losing his daughter, but that he had spent the night mesmerized by the Lake Como projections. He told her to use the word investment instead of wedding. He knew that for a man like Julian, the promise of a payday was far more intoxicating than the promise of a marriage. Emily practiced her lines, her voice trembling at first, but under Rick's relentless guidance, she began to find her footing. He told her that when she sent the message, she had to make it sound like she was barely keeping her father in line. He said that Julian needed to feel a sense of urgency, a fear that if he didn't act now, the $750,000 might slip through his fingers. Rick watched his daughter's spine straighten as the fear began to transform into a calculated, icy resolve. She was finally seeing the predator for what he was, a target. At exactly 10 in the morning, Rick handed Emily her phone. He watched over her shoulder as she typed the message they had crafted together. She wrote that she was so incredibly sorry for her father's interrogation at lunch and that he had stayed up until dawn reviewing the files. She said that Rick was actually impressed by the Lake Como acquisition and that he realized he had been being overprotective. She told Julian that her father was ready to sign the full $750,000 disbursement that afternoon, but only if they could meet at Julian's office for a formal closing of the real estate contracts. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Rick stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street for any signs of surveillance, though he knew Julian was likely too arrogant to think he needed it. 3 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Julian's reply was a masterclass in feigned hurt and strategic greed. He wrote that he was glad Rick had finally seen reason, but that the Lake Como deal was on the verge of collapsing because of the delay. He said that Victoria was furious about the insult to their family, but he had convinced her to give Rick one last chance. He agreed to the meeting at 2 o'clock at his office in the West Loop, adding that his legal team would have the papers ready. Rick felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric hum in his veins that he hadn't felt since his last major takedown before retirement. The hunter was fully awake now, his mind moving with the precision of a clockwork engine. He called Marcus and Sarah, giving them the green light. He told them the location and the time. He said that Julian had taken the bait and was currently salivating over the thought of a $750,000 score. Rick instructed Marcus to ensure that the digital trail for the fake transfer looked authentic enough to pass a cursory glance but was anchored to a federal monitoring server. The rest of the morning was a blur of tactical preparation. Rick helped Emily choose an outfit that screamed professional compliance, a soft gray suit that made her look vulnerable yet wealthy. He checked the hidden microphone he had prepared, a tiny device that would be pinned to the underside of her lapel. He told her that no matter what Julian said, no matter how much he tried to gaslight her or make her feel small, she had to remember that Rick was only a few feet away, listening to every word. Rick's own preparation was more internal. He went to his safe and pulled out his old bureau credentials, the gold shield reflecting the dim light of the study. He hadn't worn it in years, but today it felt like a part of his very skin. He thought about the previous victims, Margaret, Elena, and the others who never got their day in court. He felt a profound sense of duty, a realization that he wasn't just doing this for Emily anymore. He was doing it because the world was a better place when men like Julian Jenkins were behind bars. As they walked out to the car at 1 in the afternoon, the Chicago sky was a flat, oppressive gray. Rick looked at his daughter and saw a flicker of the girl she used to be, the one who wasn't afraid of anything. He told her that she was doing great and that they were almost at the finish line. He felt the thrill of the pursuit, the absolute certainty that the predator was about to become the prey. Julian Sterling thought he was walking into a closing meeting to secure his retirement. He had no idea that he was walking into a cage that Rick Vance had been building for 40 years. The hook was set, the line was taut, and now, it was time to pull. The sleek glass towers of the West Loop loomed over the black SUV like sentinels of corporate greed as Rick parked 2 blocks away from the address Julian had provided. Before they stepped out into the biting wind, Rick opened his laptop one last time to review the final documents Julian had emailed as a preview for the signing. It was a 15-page digital dossier titled Lake Como Acquisition and Sterling Family Trust. To an untrained eye, it looked magnificent, filled with high-resolution photographs of Italian villas and complex legal jargon that seemed to justify the $750,000 price tag. Rick moved through the pages with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years reading between the lines of federal indictments. He didn't look at the pictures of the cherry blossoms or the infinity pools. He went straight to the fine print of the vendor contracts and the corporate tax identification numbers. Within 3 minutes, he found the first fracture in the lie. The registration number for the Italian estate was missing 2 digits required by the European Union Land Registry. The tax ID for the supposed catering firm was actually registered to a dry cleaning business in a strip mall in Delaware. He looked at the digital signatures at the bottom of the page. Under the magnification of his forensic software, the jagged pixels revealed that the signatures had been lifted from another document and superimposed onto the PDF. Julian had been lazy, or perhaps he was simply so convinced of Rick's senility that he didn't think he needed to be precise. Rick felt a surge of professional disgust. He told Emily that this wasn't just a scam, it was an insult to the art of the con. He showed her the routing numbers for the initial $100,000 deposit. They didn't lead to an escrow account in Milan. They led to a private holding company in the Virgin Islands that had been flagged by the Bureau 3 years ago for money laundering. As Rick was closing the laptop, Emily's phone erupted with a series of frantic, high-pitched pings. It was a call from Julian. Rick signaled for her to answer and put it on speaker, his finger hovering over the record button on his own device. The moment the connection opened, the voice that came through the speakers was unrecognizable. The polished, charming fiancé was gone, replaced by a man whose voice was thick with a jagged, desperate aggression. Julian didn't say hello. He demanded to know where they were. He told Emily that the clock was ticking and that his patience was at an absolute end. When Emily tried to use the soft, compliant tone they had practiced, saying they were just pulling into a parking garage, Julian cut her off with a snarl. He told her that if her father tried to pull another stunt like he did at lunch, there would be no wedding and no future. He said that he was tired of playing games with a retired old man who was past his prime. Then came the threat that made Rick's grip on the steering wheel tighten until his knuckles turned as white as bone. Julian told Emily that she was lucky he was willing to overlook her family's incompetence. He said that if she didn't get her father into that office with a signed check in the next 20 minutes, he would make sure she never worked in another hospital in the country. He claimed to have files on her medical malpractice insurance that would ruin her career before the sun went down. It was a blatant, clumsy lie, but it revealed the true nature of the monster. He wasn't just after her money anymore. He wanted her soul. Emily's face went pale, her eyes darting to Rick in a moment of pure, instinctive terror. But Rick didn't flinch. He watched the recording levels on his phone, capturing every syllable of the extortion. He looked at his daughter and gave her a slow, steady nod. He told her silently to stay in character. Emily took a breath and told Julian they would be there in 5 minutes. She hung up and the silence in the car was deafening. Rick reached over and took her hand. He told her that she had just given him exactly what he needed. He explained that by threatening her career to secure a financial payment, Julian had moved from simple fraud into the realm of aggravated extortion. He said that the mask hadn't just slipped, it had been torn off and trampled. Rick felt a profound sense of clarity. He saw Julian Sterling for what he truly was, a small, panicked man hiding behind a big, expensive lie. He told Emily that they were going in now. He reminded her that Julian thought he was the hunter, but in reality, he was already in the trap. Rick checked his own sidearm, concealed beneath his heavy wool coat, and ensured his microphone was active. He told his daughter that the $750,000 was the bait, but Julian's own arrogance would be the cage. As they stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the soaring glass entrance of the office building, Rick felt the weight of 40 years of justice behind him. He looked up at the windows of the 14th floor and whispered to himself that the predator was about to find out exactly what happens when you threaten the daughter of a federal judge. The mask was gone, the monster was visible, and now it was time for the final verdict. Rick Vance stopped Emily just inside the heavy revolving doors of the West Loop office tower, finding a blind spot behind a massive marble pillar where the security cameras couldn't track their every move. The air in the lobby was sterile and smelled of expensive floor wax and industrial heating, a stark contrast to the freezing Chicago wind they had just escaped. Rick reached out and adjusted the collar of Emily's gray wool coat, his fingers moving with a precision that was entirely detached from his internal fury. He leaned in close, his voice a low, vibrating whisper that was meant only for her ears. He told her that from this moment until they walked back out of these doors, she was no longer his daughter and she was no longer a victim. He told her that she was the most important asset in a federal investigation. He reached into his own coat and tapped a small, translucent earpiece that was tucked deep into his ear canal. He asked Marcus if the feed was live. A second later, the voice of the young hacker crackled through the encrypted channel, informing Rick that he was currently sitting in a nondescript delivery van parked in the alleyway behind the building. Marcus said that he had successfully bypassed the building's local network and had looped the security footage for the 14th floor. He told Rick that he could see Julian and Victoria in the conference room of Suite 1402. He described them as looking like sharks in a feeding frenzy, pacing the floor and checking their watches every 30 seconds. Rick then asked Sarah for a status update on the legal front. The silver-haired attorney responded through the same channel, her voice calm and authoritative. She told Rick that the Assistant United States Attorney had officially signed off on the emergency warrants for wire fraud, aggravated extortion, and interstate transportation of stolen property. She said that a tactical team of 4 federal agents was currently dressed as bike messengers and delivery drivers, positioned at the north and south exits of the lobby. The trap was not just set, it was bolted to the floor. Rick turned back to Emily, taking both of her hands in his. Her skin was still cold, and he could feel the faint, rapid thrum of her pulse against his palms. He knew that the next hour would be the hardest of her life. He began the final phase of her training, a psychological technique he had used to prepare undercover agents for deep immersion assignments. He told her about the gray man theory. He explained that she had to become an empty vessel for Julian's arrogance. He told her that when Julian yelled, she should let the sound pass through her without hitting her heart. He told her that when he threatened her career, she should visualize him as a small, desperate child throwing a tantrum in a sandbox. He looked her straight in the eyes, his 73 years of experience focused into a single, piercing gaze. He told her that a predator like Julian fed on reaction. He explained that Julian needed to see her fear to feel powerful, and if she denied him that fear, he would become reckless. Rick instructed her to keep her answers short and to always look at the documents, not at Julian's face. He told her that her only job was to get Julian to verbally confirm the $750,000 figure and the Lake Como destination. He said that once those words were recorded on the wire, the case was closed. Rick reached under Emily's lapel and checked the microphone one last time. It was a state-of-the-art piece of hardware, thinner than a dime and capable of picking up a whisper from 20 feet away. He ensured the battery was full and the encryption was holding. He then checked his own sidearm, a compact semi-automatic tucked into a custom holster at the small of his back. He didn't expect to use it, but he had spent enough years in the field to know that a cornered rat was the most dangerous kind of animal. He told Emily that he would be walking into the room exactly 3 minutes after she did. He would be playing the role of the reluctant, tired father who just wanted the drama to end. As they stood there in the quiet corner of the lobby, Rick felt a profound sense of pride in the woman his daughter had become. Even through her terror, she was standing tall, her jaw set in a way that reminded him so much of her mother. He told her that she was the bravest person he had ever known. He said that Julian Sterling thought he was the smartest person in Chicago, but he was about to find out that he had picked a fight with a surgeon and a federal agent. Rick told her that the $750,000 was just a number on a piece of paper, but the justice they were about to deliver was eternal. The elevator chimed at the far end of the lobby, the gold doors sliding open like the gates of a tomb. Rick checked his watch. It was exactly 1:57 in the afternoon. He told Emily that it was time. He watched her walk toward the elevator, her step steady and her head held high. He waited until the doors closed and the floor indicator began its slow climb toward 14. Rick stepped out from behind the pillar and walked toward the security desk, flashing a fake visitor's badge he had created with Marcus's help. He didn't look at the guard, and the guard didn't look at him. He was just another wealthy old man in a tailored coat, moving through the halls of power. But inside, Rick Vance was a war room unto himself. He was calculating the angles of the room, the distance to the exits, and the exact moment he would reveal the gold shield in his pocket. He whispered into his lapel, telling Marcus and Sarah that the eagle was in the air. He stepped into the next elevator and pressed the button for 14, feeling the slight pull of gravity as he ascended toward the final confrontation. The war room was now mobile, the legal warrants were live, and the retired FBI chief was about to deliver a verdict that Julian Sterling would never forget. Rick closed his eyes for a single second, centered his breathing, and prepared to walk into the fire. The 14th floor smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. Rick Vance stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of Suite 1402, a space that was a masterpiece of corporate theater, all frosted glass and brushed steel. To a man who had raided hundreds of such offices, it felt hollow, a stage set designed to vanish at a moment's notice. He heard Julian's voice booming from the conference room at the end of the hall, a sound filled with artificial warmth and the sharp, manic edge of a man who believed he was minutes away from a life-changing windfall. Rick walked through the open glass doors and saw Emily sitting at the head of a long quartz table, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the Chicago skyline. Julian and Victoria stood behind her like guardians of a fortune they did not own. Julian turned toward Rick as he entered, his arms spread wide in a gesture of false welcome that looked rehearsed in a mirror. He said he was glad Rick had finally decided to join them and that he understood the natural hesitation of a protective father. He gestured toward a leather-bound folder resting on the table, claiming it contained the finalized deeds for the Lake Como estate and the service contracts for the most exclusive wedding planner in northern Italy. Julian pushed the folder toward Rick, mentioning that the total required for the initial buyout and the first phase of the wedding was exactly $750,000. He spoke the number with a reverent hush, as if the money itself were a holy object. Rick sat down slowly, letting the heavy ergonomic chair groan under his weight. He acted the part of the weary, comfortable patriarch, sighing as he flipped through the glossy photos Julian had provided. He asked if the money would truly buy the security his daughter deserved. Victoria stepped forward then, her voice a soothing hum, promising that Emily would be treated like royalty in their family. She said that this investment was not just for a wedding day, but for a lifetime of prestige and heritage that the Sterling name represented. Rick watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted toward his breast pocket every time he moved his hand toward his fountain pen. Julian was practically vibrating with greed, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the quartz surface. He told Rick that the Italian banking hours were nearly over for the day and that they needed the wire transfer initiated immediately to hold the property. He pushed a second document across the table, a formal authorization for the release of $750,000 from Rick's private holdings into a numbered escrow account. He told Rick that once he signed the line at the bottom of page 4, the dream would become a reality. He even offered Rick a gold-plated pen, a cheap accessory meant to make a criminal transaction feel like a historic treaty. Rick did not take the pen. Instead, he reached into his own briefcase and pulled out a thick, blood-red folder. He placed it directly on top of Julian's contract, the weight of the paper landing with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the silent, glass room. Rick looked Julian straight in the eyes, his gaze now entirely devoid of any feigned exhaustion or paternal warmth. He told Julian that he had brought his own set of documents for review. He said he felt it was only fair that both parties were completely transparent before such a large sum of money changed hands. Julian laughed, a sharp and nervous sound that died quickly in the cold air of the room. He asked what could possibly be in a red folder that was not already covered in the official Sterling Global documents. Rick opened the folder and flipped the first page. It was a high-resolution copy of a mugshot from Nevada. Rick said that the man in the photo looked remarkably like a younger version of Arthur Jenkins, a man who had been arrested for grand larceny and identity theft 7 years ago. He watched the color drain from Julian's face as if someone had pulled a plug in his soul. Rick turned the next page without a word. It was a marriage certificate from Arizona, dated 10 years ago, showing that Julian and Victoria were not siblings, but husband and wife. Rick looked at Victoria and noted that her syrupy charm had finally curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He said that the Sterling family seemed to have a very flexible definition of the word sister. He told them that in his professional experience, siblings did not usually share a joint bank account in the Cayman Islands registered under a fraudulent marriage license. Emily stood up then, her eyes hard and her voice finally finding the strength she had lost months ago. She asked Julian if the $85,000 she had already given him was currently being used to fund his ex-wife's wardrobe or their next escape. Julian tried to reach for the red folder, his movements frantic and clumsy, but Rick slammed his hand down on the table with a force that made the courts ring. Rick told him to sit back down. He told him that he was not finished delivering the evidence. The final document Rick pulled out was a list of names typed in a stark, black font. Margaret Holloway. Elena Rossi. He read them aloud, his voice low and steady like a funeral bell. He said that these were the women who had paid for Julian's designer suits and his leased office space. He told Julian that the $750,000 he was demanding today was the exact amount Arthur Jenkins had tried to steal from a tech firm in Seattle before he vanished into the night. The air in the room was electric with a different kind of tension now. Julian was no longer the polished venture capitalist. He was a trapped animal, his eyes darting toward the glass doors and the elevator bank beyond. Victoria was whispering frantically into her phone, her thumb stabbing at the screen, but Rick knew she was only hitting a deadline. Marcus had already severed their outgoing communications and looped their cellular signals. Rick leaned forward, his face inches from Julian's. He told him that he had spent 40 years watching men like him think they were the smartest people in the room. He said that the 2 words he had spoken at the restaurant were not just a request, they were a legal demand. "Prove it," Rick whispered, his voice a lethal rasp. He told Julian that now was his only chance to prove that he was not a bottom-feeding parasite. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The smug mask had not just shattered, it had been ground into the carpet by the weight of the truth. He looked at the red folder, then at the silent, watching city beyond the glass, and realized that for the first time in his career, he was the one who had been profiled. Rick sat back, crossed his arms, and waited. He knew the federal agents were already in the building. He knew the wire on Emily's lapel had captured every word of the $750,000 demand and the admission of the Lake Como fiction. He looked at his daughter and saw her finally standing tall, her shadow falling over the man who had tried to steal her future. The standoff was over, and the final verdict was about to be delivered in iron and ink. Julian Sterling sat frozen as the recorded voice of Elena Rossi filled the sterile glass conference room, her words echoing with the hollow resonance of a life that had been systematically dismantled. The woman in the recording spoke of a destination wedding in Tuscany and a textile mill investment that had cost her $350,000 and her sanity. Julian's hands, which had been so steady while gesturing toward the $750,000 contract, began to tremor. He looked at the red folder on the table as if it were a live explosive, his breathing becoming shallow and jagged. Rick Vance sat in his chair like a granite statue, his eyes never leaving the man who had tried to prey on his daughter. He told Julian that the recording was only the first of 5. He said he had statements from women in Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix, all detailing the same psychological warfare and the same financial execution. He watched as Victoria's polished veneer finally disintegrated, her face twisting into a mask of feral desperation. She hissed at Julian to get up, telling him that this was a trap and that they had to leave immediately. Julian shoved his chair back with such force that it skidded across the hardwood floor, the screech of metal on wood sounding like a scream. He stood up, his chest heaving, and pointed a trembling finger at Rick. He shouted that Rick was a delusional old man who was obsessed with the past. He claimed that the names in the folder meant nothing to him and that he and Emily were leaving to start their life together. He reached for Emily's arm, his grip tightening in a way that was no longer an embrace but a kidnapping. Emily did not flinch. She looked down at his hand on her sleeve with the detached curiosity of a surgeon examining a tumor. She told him to let go of her. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a lethal weight that stopped Julian in his tracks. She said that she had spent 10 months believing she was the problem, but now she realized that he was nothing more than a parasite with a good tailor. She pulled her arm away, stepping back toward her father. Rick reached into his coat and spoke 2 words into his hidden microphone: "Take them." The heavy glass doors at the entrance of the suite did not just open, they were thrown back with the force of an incoming tide. The 4 men Rick had positioned in the lobby, the ones Julian had dismissed as harmless delivery drivers and bike messengers, stormed into the room. They were no longer carrying packages. They were wearing tactical vests with the bold, golden letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their chests. Their weapons were drawn, their movements a choreographed dance of lethal precision. Julian tried to bolt toward the secondary exit that led to the executive washrooms, but he was met by a 5th agent who had been waiting in the shadows of the hallway. He was tackled to the floor with a dull thud, his face slammed against the polished quartz of the conference table. The sound of the ratcheting handcuffs was sharp and rhythmic, a series of metallic clicks that signaled the end of Arthur Jenkins's long run. Victoria was forced into a chair, her hands secured behind her back as she began to scream about her constitutional rights and her high-priced legal counsel. The lead agent, a man with a scarred jaw whom Rick had mentored 20 years ago, stepped toward the table. He looked at the retired chief and gave a sharp, professional nod. He told Rick that the tactical teams had already secured the Jenkins's luxury apartment in the Gold Coast and were currently freezing every account tied to the Sterling Global Fund. He said that they had found a suitcase packed with $50,000 in cash and 3 different passports in the master bedroom. Rick stood up, his 73 years of life feeling lighter than they had in a decade. He walked over to where Julian was pinned against the table, the man's expensive silk tie now dipped in a spilled glass of water. Rick leaned down, his face only inches from the man who had tried to steal his daughter's future. He told Julian that his biggest mistake was not the fake contracts or the shell companies in the Virgin Islands. He said that Julian's fatal error was believing that a man's age was a sign of his weakness. He looked at Julian's terrified, sweating face and told him that he had spent 40 years watching predators think they were the smartest people in the room. He said that Julian was not a mastermind, he was just another file in a cabinet that Rick Vance had finally decided to close. Rick told him that the $750,000 he had demanded was now the primary evidence in a federal racketeering case that would ensure he never saw the sun rise over a luxury villa again. As the agents hauled Julian and Victoria toward the elevators, the office felt suddenly, remarkably quiet. The predator was in irons, the smug mask was gone, and the long shadow of Arthur Jenkins had finally been shortened to the length of a prison cell. Rick watched them go, his hand resting on Emily's shoulder. He felt the tension finally drain out of his daughter's body as she watched the doors close on the man who had tried to break her. The verdict had been delivered, and for the first time in 10 months, the air in Chicago felt clean again. Rick turned to his daughter and told her that the surgery was over and that it was time to go home. The cold bite of the Chicago winter had finally given way to the gentle humming warmth of late spring. Rick Vance sat on his wrought iron balcony overlooking the Gold Coast, watching the sun dip below the horizon of Lake Michigan in a blaze of orange and violet. For the first time in many years, the air around him felt light, devoid of the heavy shadows that had haunted his brownstone during those 10 months of deception. The justice system had moved with the slow, grinding certainty of a mountain. 2 weeks ago, the final gavel had fallen in a federal courtroom downtown. Arthur Jenkins and Victoria Jenkins were each sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal facility for their roles in an interstate racketeering and extortion conspiracy. All their seized assets, including the $50,000 in cash from their apartment, were being redistributed to their surviving victims through a court-mandated fund. Inside the house, Rick could hear the familiar sounds of life returning to normal. Emily was in the kitchen, humming a quiet tune as she prepared dinner. She had returned to her position as a lead neonatal surgeon 3 months ago, her hands as steady and precise as they had ever been. The therapy had been long and difficult, a slow process of unlearning the lies that Arthur had whispered into her ear, but she had emerged from the fire with a strength that even Rick found awe-inspiring. She no longer looked at the world with the eyes of a victim. She looked at it with the clarity of a survivor who knew the value of her own worth. Rick looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held a gold shield for 40 years. He realized that the greatest victory wasn't seeing Arthur and Victoria in orange jumpsuits. The true victory was sitting right there in his kitchen. He had saved more than just $750,000. He had saved his daughter's spirit. He understood now that his retirement hadn't been an end to his service, but a transition into the most important case of his life. A judge never truly stops being a judge, and a father never truly stops being a shield for his children. The story of Rick and Emily serves as a powerful reminder of the world we live in today. It teaches us that trust is a sacred currency that must be earned through consistency, transparency, and respect, not through grand gestures and expensive promises. True love never makes its presence conditional on how much someone is willing to pay or how much they are willing to sacrifice of their own identity. This story also highlights the vital importance of intuition. If something feels too good to be true, it often is. Vigilance is not a sign of a lack of love, it is the highest form of self-respect and protection for those we cherish. In a world where predators often wear the masks of polished professionals and charming companions, the value of family and the wisdom of experience are our strongest defenses. Rick's legacy was not his bank account or his titles, but the fact that he was willing to stand in the gap for his daughter when she couldn't see the danger herself. We must learn to listen to the quiet warnings of our hearts and the voices of those who have walked the path before us. We hope this story has touched your heart and provided a moment of reflection on the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. If you found value in this narrative, please take a moment to click the subscribe button for our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you high-quality, emotionally resonant stories every single day. Please give this video a like and share it with your friends and family so that they too can be reminded of the importance of protecting the ones they love. We are curious to hear from you. How did this story make you feel as you watched Rick and Emily navigate this dark chapter? Have you ever encountered someone in your own life who seemed too perfect to be real, Or have you ever had to rely on a family member to help you see the truth when you were blinded by emotion? We truly want to hear your thoughts and experiences. Please share your comments below and let us listen to the feelings from deep within your heart. Your stories and insights are what make this community so special. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We wish every single one of you watching this video a life filled with good health, joy, and peace in every moment. May you find the strength to protect what matters most and the wisdom to recognize the truth in all its forms. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.